is Raj Kannan. I'm the head of infrastructure and real estate for Deloitte Asia Pacific. I am based in Jakarta. I've been now for 17 years. It's now my pleasure to invite my distinguished panel. Shall I start with Ambassador Kim Chang-Beom? Please join me. Ambassador Kim used to be the ambassador of South Korea in Indonesia a long time ago. We used to have pleasant dinners at his place. Can I now invite John Denton from the International Chamber of Commerce? Please join us. And my good friend Ray Nadarajah. He's one of the partners of Global Infrastructure Partners. And of course, Mr. Choi, the Institute of Southeast Asia Studies. Thank you all. Please be seated. So, I guess firstly, I'd like to apologize on behalf of the coordinating minister for infrastructure, who's unable to join us today. The purpose of today's session was to effectively work with the distinguished panel and the ministry to explore how we could, Indonesia could attract more private sector investments. We will explore some of those questions with the panel, but any questions that's related to the minister, we will have a session with him potentially after the 2 days to appraise him on what were the same as some of the questions that was raised. So if you have any questions towards the end of the session, please be ready with those questions. If they can be answered by the panel, they will be. If there are any questions to the government, then I take responsibility to raise it with the coordinating minister. With that, let me start by, as I mentioned, I've been here now for a while, and 17 years is a long time in any country. And in that time, I've spent quite a lot of time on infrastructure space. In the last 10 years in particular, just to set the stage, the Indonesian government has done tremendous amount of development in infrastructure, right? For example, in the last 10 years, we have built over 366,000 kilometers of village roads, and we've done 1,900 kilometers of bridges in villages. We've done 2,700 kilometers of toll roads and almost 6,000 kilometers of national roads. These are impressive performance in the last 10 years. In terms of irrigation network, they have built over 1.1 million hectares. In terms of dams, there have been over 40 plus dams that's been built across the country. And in terms of the transportation side, in the last 10 years, the government of Indonesia has built over 44 ferry terminals and 27 new airports, 28 new seaports, and has also built 55 new railway lines. These are impressive undertaking that the government has delivered in the last 10 years. The key question now in the mind of most investors is, most of this infrastructure has been built with the involvement of state-owned enterprises, which is the reality, because in most economies, particularly when it's at a developing stage, the IRR is not necessarily as attractive. So therefore, whether the government like it or not, they had to rely on the performance of the state-owned companies to help build, right? So with that as a framework, let me start with a question to Ambassador Kim. Given your role as the head of the Korean industries, and Korea, has been, one of the forerunners in infrastructure development in the region, and also Korea is an investor in Indonesia. Where do you see that in terms of leveraging the existing infrastructures, where do you see that Indonesia should focus on?
Well, Raj, thank you so much for the introduction. And let me just say hello to everybody. It's Selamat Siang. As was introduced by Raj, I've been serving in Indonesia twice, dua kali. The first service as a counselor at the embassy, Korean embassy in Jakarta, was from 2003 to 2005. And then I served as Korean ambassador to Indonesia, mantan duta besar untuk Indonesia dari tahun 2018 sampai tahun 2020. So for me, I feel like Pulang Kampung is kind of country boy is returning back to my old hometown. But while I was witnessing the whole infrastructure development throughout the whole almost 2 decades, from my personal association with Indonesia, I think as was well pointed out by Raj, it's a sea change. The infrastructure development, especially under President Jokowi's term, is huge development were made. I personally took a bus from Jakarta to Surabaya in 2019 when Trans-Java toll road was inaugurated. Right after that, I personally took the bus and then just enjoyed the ride on that expressway from Jakarta to Surabaya. Of course, I made some stops to some of the cities along the Trans-Java toll road. And then I made some travels from Aceh to Papua. So I did personally witness some of the infrastructure development that were related to airport, the seaport, and some of the transport networks. In terms of South Korea's experience, I think there's, as Raz has mentioned in his earlier opening, up until now, the infrastructure development has been planned, initiated, implemented, and evaluated mostly by the government through SOEs. I think that's under the leadership of President Prabowo, it seems to me, of course, I'm not monitoring closely day-to-day announcement by the new government, but it seems like this public sector-led infrastructure development might be well backed up through the new initiative by the President Prabowo, by the private sector, and not only from domestic business community, but also from the global business community. And especially I think this public-private partnership might be one of the important tools that the new government is trying to embrace. So public-private partnership, in our case, in South Korea case, is the leading engine or the source of kind of the implementation for the huge infrastructure development that we have experienced.
Thank you, Ambassador Kim. Perhaps I think that's a good segue to invite Ray, who is a partner in Global Infrastructure Partners, one of the largest infrastructure fund in the world and also the largest investors. Ray, you've been kicking tires in Indonesia for a while now, and you have a few investments. How do you see, in terms of what Ambassador Kim mentioned, utilizing public-private partnerships, how do we leverage some of the assets that's been built and also opening up some of the new areas for private investment, like in the airports, in transmissions, etc.
Sure, no, thanks, Raj. A pleasure to be here, and thanks for the kind introduction. So a little bit of context. So Global Infrastructure Partners, we're a $180 billion private infrastructure investment vehicle that's now part of BlackRock. We integrated into BlackRock just a few months ago. But we've been focused on really 4 sectors. We're an operational efficiency focused infra investor in energy, transport, water and waste, and digital. And so in Indonesia, for example, one of our renewable platforms, Vina Energy, is present in Indonesia. We have over 50 employees. We have 2 wind farms. We also involved in the potential export to Singapore power project that will involve a large-scale solar and batteries development near the islands of Riau. We also have another portfolio company, ISEAS, which is one of the largest water treatment and distribution waste-to-energy players in the world. And ISEAS has been active in Indonesia. And in fact, historically, ISEAS was the original concessionaire for Jakarta, half of Jakarta. I see some nods in the audience, so I think hopefully that's accurate. So we would like to do more in Indonesia. The sectors we like, Raj, I mean, we're the largest owner-operator of airports in the world. So we own Sydney Airport, Gatwick Airport, Edinburgh. We just partnered with the Malaysian government to take private Malaysia airports. That's KL Airport plus all the regional airports in Malaysia. That will conclude at the end of this month. So we have a $250 million portfolio in airports. In ports, we're the largest investor in landlord ports. We are very large in the data center space. So with BlackRock, about 6 months ago, we announced a $100 billion AI in data center investment platform that will be an open-ended fund together, GIP, BlackRock, Mubadala, NVIDIA, Microsoft, to invest in AI-enabled data centers and power infrastructure around the world. And that's something we hope we'll be able to invest in Southeast Asia in due course. And amongst other sectors, things like LNG, a big investor in LNG projects, pipelines, transmission, etc. Renewables, of course, we have about 6 platforms around the world with 200 gigawatts of capacity, including Vina, which is about a 40 gigawatt platform headquartered in Singapore across 10 countries. So we are large investors, long-term investors. There's a lot of potential in subsectors in Indonesia. I think airports, you mentioned, Raj, specifically, there's still potential for further operational enhancement, and that's where we think the private sector can add a lot of value to the airport system in the country. I think the same thing would apply for ports. If we look at the water sector, the penetration rate for piped water is still very low in the country. Still needs a lot of private investment in water distribution, treatment, and there are some private sector players active in this space. I think on the digital side, in data centers, quite frankly, there's a lot of untapped potential because Indonesia has been losing to Malaysia in the fight for Singapore spillover capacity. So Johor, which is a skip and a hop away from Singapore, is now north of 5 gigawatts under development in 3 years, whereas Batam, Bintan, Riau, for various reasons, is still at the early stage of scaling up. And I think there's a lot of strong potential for large-scale data center development. Clearly, a key enabler of that will be power infrastructure and power generation that needs to come in.
Thanks, Ray. Maybe, John, I'll go to you. I mean, besides your role with the International Chamber of Commerce, you're also involved in a fund in Australia. And my understanding is Australian funds, though, for lack of a better word, been kicking tires within Indonesia, we haven't seen any substantial investment. What can we learn from that reluctance, and what can the new government under Prabowo do to change that mindset?
Well, thanks very much, and it's great to be here. I mean, I have the pleasure in my CV of once chairing the Trade Investment Experts Group on Australia and Indonesia with Mari Pengetsu, who I will be seeing tomorrow. So I've been involved with Indonesia for a long time. I wear a couple of hats here. First of all, I lead the International Chamber of Commerce. We're based in Paris. We've been around for 100 years. Our purpose is to enable business worldwide. We enable just on $17 trillion worth of economic activity. Trade finance, for example, wouldn't happen without the ICC. We have the world leading court, private court of arbitration. So we're not an observer of economic activity, we're actually a participant ourselves. And in that context, I'm interested in Indonesia about how do we enable Indonesian business here. I also wear another hat, which is I'm on the board of IFM Global Investors out of Australia. We're an interesting sort of analog in a way to GIP. I mean, we are pension capital. So it's a different form of capital. And I've recently been involved in some quite complex transactions involving IFM in various capitals where national security assets are involved. And often public officials don't know the difference between different forms of capital. Pension capital is patient capital. It's actually a very aligned partner for public-private partnerships. And the reason I say that is we're actually generally more interested in the macroeconomic fundamentals of an economy rather than the day-to-day rides, because we're not a get-in, get-out play. So I wear that hat as well. I also co-chair finance and infrastructure in the B20, G20 process. I've been involved last year with Brazil, looking at these issues, and the South Africans have asked me to continue that role. So when I look at Indonesia, it's with those three hats on. We really want to enable this economy to provide the best opportunities for business to prosper. A couple of things that have already been mentioned is that one of the challenges we see is actually the dearth of, I think, opportunities for private capital to be deployed effectively and at scale here. I think one of we had the pleasure and privilege of hosting President Prabowo when he was in Paris on his way through, particularly as he was president-elect at the time. And one of the things that pleased us very much was the disposition that he showed there. And I think just the reality that you can go so far with leveraging state-owned enterprises, but at the end of the day, we may well have run our race there. And now the opportunity is, how do you create the space for private capital? And there are some opportunities there. One of the things that we have advocated for, and we're glad to see it taken up as a policy continuation from President Choi to President Prabowo, is accession, frankly, to the OECD. That sends a very clear signal to private capital that the government is serious. This is a very positive signal. There's one thing between announcing the process of accession, the next thing is delivering on it. But the reality is that the roadmap will be there. I was just meeting with my old mate Pak Bakri at Carden, who's now got 23 working groups operating out of Carden. There's a lot of moving parts here which need to be put in place. But that signal of the acceptance of the need to raise standards to make it easier to deploy private capital is very important. If I could, there are some issues that will be revealed through that, and I think will be facilitated, because one of the inhibitors for pension capital to be deployed here is not just the quality of the returns, but actually the ability to get the return. I mean, we do not want to be subject to lower standards of governance, and I think raising the standards of governance here and grappling head on with this conception of Indonesia as a place where corruption is rife is something that the process of OECD accession, I think, will help shape out. Everyone is saying the right thing and everyone is sending those signals, but at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding. We need to ensure that not only are the returns of a substantive that are available here, but also the ability to deploy is there, but also the way in which you deploy governance is very important as well. The other issue is, and I think this is something where President Prabowo has been very clear, is raising human capital. Again, I think even in Australia, we know that people talk a lot about infrastructure investment, and there are lots of plans, and many would say Australia is a blueprint for success, but I think those of us who've lived through it know that there's a challenge there. There's not enough human capital available to deploy all the projects which are announced. one of the challenges here is to lift the level of human capital available. You can only deal with the realities. The geography of Indonesia is challenging, but as you were saying in your opening comments, it's amazing what's been done. But that is actually also a challenge, but one of the great opportunities, because infrastructure connectivity is key. The other issue that we're looking at, and I suppose I look at it particularly because of the ICC's role here, is the ability to settle disputes. The actual access to private arbitration and internationally renowned arbitration will be critical, I think. And that's why we've been talking to the government about how we at the ICC can support that. And there are things we can do to make that easier as well. Anyway, I'll pause there. There's a few challenges out there, but hopefully some constructive observations as well.
Thanks, John. If I may, Mr. Choi, given your Southeast Asia centric role and given you've been one of the pioneers in studying the politics and economics of this region, where do you see Indonesia, at least in the next 5 years, can make the improvements, and how do we leverage the investment that has already been made by the government, and how do we get better at attracting more private sector investment?
Well, thank you. First of all, let me say what a great pleasure it is to be able to be invited here by the IBC to come to join this conference. I've been tremendously encouraged by what I heard in the whole morning, because all the presentations have really touched on issues that if I was advising the government, I would definitely mention to them. And in a way, many of the things have been checked off the box. My organization, we're using our old name, with the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, almost a 60-year-old institution based in Singapore. We study Southeast Asia, obviously, but we look at both the politics, the economics, and also the social developments in the region, and always based on contemporary issues. We are quite prolific as a publishing house. Articles go out every day, and it's available free for anyone who wants to read them. And it's also we also have seminars that are available globally through webinar subscription, again free of charge. You can just register, and we have every week we have at least two webinars on contemporary Southeast Asian subjects. So if I may try to answer the question a little differently, I think that Indonesia has come a long way, and as we saw in the presentations this morning, especially some of the charts, it has been kind of not a straight path up, but has been up and down over the last 5-6 decades. And it is now trying to climb into the, if you like, the golden age. And that requires 7 to 8% growth every year. That is indeed a very, very ambitious target. But there are others who have gone before. And I would say that if the infrastructure is to continue to grow, it must come from FDI. It must come from outside of Indonesia. In a way, the infrastructure that has been built so far are kind of lower hanging fruits. Now it has to go for the more difficult, perhaps also more ambitious kind of projects. But again, there's no need to kind of reinvent the wheel. There are other countries that have gone through this, and they've succeeded. So obviously one of them is China. Another one I would say to some extent a more contemporary, if you like, competitor of Indonesia is Vietnam. And in Vietnam, what they have done, like China, they have invested a lot in terms of the SEZs, special economic zones. Now, this is not new, of course, to Indonesia. Indonesia itself has, 22 SEZs and counting, but actually not all of them are successful. And I think the important thing is to try and draw in infrastructure spending and investment around SEZs, because it's not possible to basically get investment in every part of Indonesia at the same time. So it must be in places where there is ready demand, there is ready connectivity, and also the access to markets is really quite convenient. So this strategy itself is somewhat straightforward in theory. As Pak Ashad said, it's not so much the theory that's the difficult part, is the action, how to actually make this work. And SEZs generally work if you have some of these exogenous factors tied in the study. But it also requires tremendous effort to the one who's running the SEZ. They must have the mindset. As Pak Lahut said, how can I make and let the business come in and make money? If they come in and they don't make money, the story is going to get around, they're not going to come back. And those that are there are going to leave. So it has to be successful through great facilitation. How does China, Vietnam, and if you go even further back, how does Singapore succeed? Through great facilitation. When businesses need to come in, they need to be able to be helped so that they can make money. And I think when that happens, story gets around, I think investors are going to come rolling in. So there is, I think, a success story in a SEZ that's near to Singapore, in the island of Batam. It's always outgrown the national growth rate, but there are periods when it really outgrew the national growth rate, and there are periods when it just about slightly higher than the national growth rate. So it depends on how well facilitated that particular SEZ is. And so I think that's the lesson for me, and I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mr. Choi. In fact, I think in terms of what you were saying, the low-hanging fruit has been, most of it been delivered by, without substantial FDI. So going forward is effectively how to attract FDI. So if I may, Ambassador Kim, South Korea has been one of the pioneers in PFI and public-private partnerships in terms of leveraging assets and bringing in private sector investment. One of the key growth areas that has been talked about in Indonesia, but we haven't seen much action, if you like, as Mr. Choi mentioned, and as was mentioned by Arshad as well, that the next challenge for us is executing. So in terms of executing schemes that are based on not selling government assets, but concessioning government assets like airports or like ports or like the transmission lines to attract private sector, is there anything that we can learn from the South Korean experience? And after you, sure, Ray, I'd like you to add in terms of, given your experience on the airport sector, how do you see potential Soekarno-Hatta for concessioning?
Well, there's let me just give you one kind of exemplary case that might be fitting into kind of the answers to your question. There's one public-private partnership that is between Hang Nadim International Airport in Batam and Incheon International Airport Corporation. From the year of 2022, Incheon International Airport Corporation is running Hang Nadim Airport in Batam. It's one of the examples that we could proud to present to our audience. And then that public-private partnership between Incheon Airport Corporation and Batam is actually, this is not Batam Airport, it's API. That's Airport Operation Authority in Indonesia. So that has led one of Korean airliners to initiate direct flight from Seoul Incheon International Airport to Batam. So it's, I think it's 4 days, 4 times a week, 4 flights a week. Now is that has started in sometime late last year. So I think this not only this small project that is giving additional kind of the input and resources to this infrastructure development, but is also bringing along with that some of the additional accompanying investments into, and then that's investment to people-to-people connectivity that is also crucial to also to help increase the further kind of the attractions of Indonesia as a potential investment destination. And then maybe this, it might be a bit different from what you have asked, but there might be some quick solutions that the Indonesian government and also the private sector should work on, rather than just attracting new foreign direct investment and then formulating a new partnership between the public sector and private sector. Maybe I could mention three. There is quite low-hanging fruit from the government perspective, is that to streamline regulatory processes. That simplifying the regulatory framework is quite essential and quite crucial to invite private participation in infrastructure projects. And the second, maybe we may not deal with every port, every airport, every harbors, or every the industrial zone facilities. Maybe we should focus on some infrastructure hubs, so that it's a prioritization might be a key to making the first initial steps to accelerate this policies implementation initiated by the new government. So whether that would be Bali or Surabaya or some key locations that the new government will be putting greater emphasis on. The last one is regional connectivity should be in mind. It's not just airport, not just harbor, not just bus terminal, not just airport linkage. I think there's regional connectivity in and around the whole area should be well in advance, planned, and then implemented. That should also give another kind of the higher kind of the momentum for the future investors to look at.
Yeah, thanks, Ambassador Kim. Just on that, I mean, I think Ray, I mean, if we were to use India as a model, India has 125 commercial airports. They brought in private sector concession to only 4 of them, and those 4 airports are now generating, almost $8 billion in revenue to the Airports Authority of India. That enables the Airports Authority to actually develop airports in the rural areas, right? So, Soekarno-Hatta, yes, it is the primary main access to Indonesia, but the reality is 50 years ago, airports were strategic assets because of world wars and etc. But 50 years later, airports are no longer strategic assets. Almost every country's main airport is run by private sector through concessioning. So Ray, you've been involved in this for many years. Do you see Soekarno-Hatta being one of those prime first cap of the rank, if you like, for the purposes of concessioning?
Yeah, sure, Raj. Maybe I'll answer your question, which is a very good question, shortly, but perhaps a bit of context. I think if you look around the world, in a lot of the big developing countries, north of 100 million population, and the big developed countries, I mean, it's not uncommon to have a lot of the airports, ports, other key critical, what's deemed to be strategic critical infrastructure, privatized, semi-privatized, or involving partnerships with the private sector. So I think, as Mr. Choi mentioned, I think we are a big advocate of not reinventing the wheel. There's a lot of proven case studies of what works in many large emerging countries, middle-income countries, higher, upper middle-income countries that I think Indonesia will continue to sort of to learn from and essentially adapt, and they've already been doing that to an extent. So we're excited about the new administration plans in that regard. Australia, as an example, all the state airports are privatized. The capital city airport is privatized. You look at the UK, people don't realize Greater London has 5 airports. 5 airports serving around 180 million passengers. So we took over Gatwick Airport about 14 years ago. The private sector can bring efficiencies and a focus that usually the incumbents do not bring. So through our involvement in Gatwick, we turned Gatwick, which is a single runway airport, into the most efficient runway on planet Earth. We're now doing 60 movements per hour at peak traffic, which is 1 landing or takeoff a minute, and we're taking it from 60 to 70. We're doing 600 bags through 1 X-ray machine per hour. Heathrow is doing about 250, for example, and that's a function of 600 initiatives that we put into Gatwick to drive efficiency and performance. So I think private sector will bring a different focus, different synergies, and we're excited about the prospect under this administration, which Pak Luhut touched on, with the passing of the SOE law, with the creation of Danantara. We hope there's an ability to forge new partnerships with the SOEs to bring in the private sector expertise and capital. And as John touched on, there's different types of capital, right? There's active, operationally focused investors. There's sort of more longer dated pension investors who don't need an exit. There's obviously the multilaterals and the ODAs, and that can help with de-risking and taking on risks that the rest of the private sector are not willing to do. So there's a full gambit, and the scale of the opportunity or the scale of the need is large enough to create opportunities for all. And to Mr. Choi's point, and we really believe, China, what was so incredible about China's success early on, what they did is bring in foreign investors into their national champions, whether it's the big 3 oil and gas companies or the telco companies and others, bilaterally. And through that, they created an ecosystem, a halo effect of other large foreign investors who obviously follow suit and come in. We think Indonesia has done that to a degree, but there's a lot of potential, especially under this administration, to break through and really take it to the next level, right? And so as BlackRock, as GIP, we're very optimistic and sort of very hopeful that we can participate in that. So to airports specifically, Raj, yes, I think it is. There's a lot of potential. I mean, an airport, to your point, is not strategic. What's strategic about an airport? An airport is essentially a real estate and logistics play. You're taking people and bags from the curbside to the plane and from the plane to the curbside. What's strategic about it, and still can be strategic and protected by the government, is the airspace management, because there's a military component to that, there's a national security component to that, and most concessions, the private concessionaire doesn't get involved in airspace anyways. That's retained by the government or civil aviation. And the second point, of course, there's a sort of customs or security element to it, which usually is retained by the government. So the same thing could apply to a port. The same thing, frankly, for transmission. Poles and wires. There's nothing very strategic about it. That's a big opportunity in Indonesia to open up the energy sector. More of the generation, transmission, distribution, actually huge potential to bring in private capital with the right risk framework in transmission, which you touched on, Raj, which then the government can recycle that capital, invest in other parts of the country and other sectors. But we've seen Brazil and India, by way of example, 2 large similar economies in terms of large populations, growing, urbanizing economies that have successfully opened up the energy sector and brought in large amount of foreign capital.
Thanks, Ray. In fact, I mean, interesting you touched on ODAs in terms of using official development assistance for developing countries. I'm not sure how many of you are aware, when China opened its doors for international investments in 1980, from 1980 to 2005, over a period of 25 years, Japan was the largest ODA investor in China. Japan lent and provided assistance up to 35 trillion Japanese dollars, which was at that time, and it was equivalent to about 35 billion US dollars, which is more than $1 billion a year. That was used to build airports, ports, all of the infrastructure that, to an extent, Japan cannibalized its own economy, where China became the second largest economy in the world, and Japan became the third largest economy in the world. And Japan's logic was a simple concept of prosper thy neighbor. And some of you may be aware that MRT in Jakarta is the first project that was, well, one of the most recent successful projects that's funded with ODA. But having been involved in the project, there was a lot of objections for ODA because of the perception that it's going to be all built by Japanese, or it's going to be built by Chinese, etc. So China is a good example to break that. So Mr. Choi, if I may, given your Southeast Asia focused role, how do you see, besides private sector FDI related investments, do you see a role for government to government role to, either in a bilateral, multilateral way to improve the infrastructure facilities within Indonesia, for example?
Okay, let me try and answer that a bit more indirectly. Start off with saying who has actually, in terms of foreign investors, actually already invested in Indonesia in the last, say, 2 decades. China, definitely, and that a lot of that is through SOEs, and it's through the, if you like, the flagship program of the BRI. But that's kind of changing, because the BRI itself has been kind of scaled back from hard infrastructure, it's going more into soft infrastructure. And of course, China's own economy needs to conserve more resources now because they have issues to solve back in their own homeland. Indonesia, however, has always had investors coming from elsewhere. So you mentioned the MRT project came from Japan. Japan actually wanted to do the high-speed rail as well, but then I think that got allocated to China. So Japan had been a keen investor in Indonesia. So they've been here, they built the MRT, and I think there's a new line that's also in the process of being built. Other investors have come in. The Europeans have been here. They've been investing perhaps a bit more in aspects that are less tangible in services and so on. There are supermarkets and so on. They have come in. I think Singapore has been a big investor, always seen as one of the biggest investors in Indonesia, but it is both combination of Singapore-based investors as well as Singapore domiciled investors. So there's been, I would say, a diversity in terms of investment into Indonesia. Going forward, I think Indonesia has to be open to all sides. Now that we all know there's going to be a lot more geopolitical competition going on, and also pressures to perhaps choose between investors. I think that Indonesia should just be open and bring in investors wherever they can come from, including, of course, government aid. One of the reasons why the Japanese are big in ODA is because they have kind of seen their ODA in the past as a form of, shall we say, compensation for the way that it had the past war that had taken place in Southeast Asia, and so they, as a way of, in that sense, compensation, they've also come in with ODA, and now also with corporate investment. So I think that will continue. Everybody is keen to tap into the Indonesian economy, but the big part of it is it's got to be beyond industries that today actually are already firing on several cylinders. So I think earlier in the morning it was said that Indonesia needs to do new things, right? So yes, they can privatize the airports, I think that's a great way to release more resources so that it can be investing into other areas. But Indonesia also needs investors that come in with know-how that will then spawn off new industries here. And ODA generally doesn't do that. ODA can help in infrastructure that is perhaps more strategic, perhaps a bit more of the kind of infrastructure that is domestically inclined. But for investments that can pay off and also build new industries, I think it has to come from the private sector.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, to clarify, I mean, when we talk about, and in fact Ray mentioned and John and others, when we talk about concessioning of infrastructure, it's not government selling the asset. Globally, the concept of government selling strategic assets or even non-strategic assets no longer exist. So under a concessioning scheme, the private sector pays the government an agreed amount upfront for the right to take over that asset and run it, say, for 35 years or 50 years. The government still owns the asset. Because I think that's an important clarification to understand. We are not talking about selling wholesale government assets, but we are talking about how to leverage the private sector's financial capability, operational capability, like what Ray alluded to bring in efficiency, and at the same time, to add funding to the government's coffers, which the government can then use for other infrastructure projects or social projects, etc. So, John, if I can come to you, one of the things that you mentioned is, this governance within Indonesia. You may have heard, or in fact, Ray mentioned that the government recently amended the state-owned company laws. Most of you are aware, Indonesia is quite unique that if you're a CEO of a state-owned company, if you cost, based on your decision, a loss, it used to be classified as a state loss, which unfortunately ended up you may be going to jail. So that has now been changed. So it's now, that loss is classified as a loss of the state-owned company, not of the state. So do you see that as helping Indonesia to move forward in a much more positive way?
Well, look, maybe I'll frame it up slightly differently, because there is also a danger that everyone thinks that global capital is just waiting for Indonesia to do X, Y, and Z. The reality is global capital is pretty fickle, and there's a lot of competitors for access to it. If there's one thing you've seen over the last 5-6 years in particular, and the numbers in this can be quite frightening, is that global capital is actually not mobilizing towards developing and emerging economies. It's actually mobilizing much more towards advanced economies, which tells you there's a competition there, which also tells you that there are also some inhibitors there. And it's not just the actions of economies themselves, there's also some frameworks that do not act in a way that support or make it easier for a global capital to find a home in developing and emerging economies. I'll give you one example, and this is something that I'm working on in the G20. It's called macroprudential regulatory frameworks. This was set up after the global financial crisis to ensure that what happened would never happen again, that the financial system would never suffer such an enormous shock, and so they put in place what's called the Financial Stability Board as part of the Bank of International Settlement. And that was directed by the G20 to be enabled. One of the rules that operates there is that a company cannot hold a credit rating higher than the economy in which it operates, okay? The problem or the challenge for that is if a country's sovereign rating is downgraded, then automatically there's a cost to the business. And automatically for the economy itself, it becomes challenging because the actual cost of capital goes up. That was a rule that was put in place in 2008, 2009. Since then, we've had COVID. Since then, we've had the physical consequences of inaction on climate. Since then, we've seen a lot of geopolitical instability. There's a lot of things that are happening which are outside economies' control. So the sovereign downgrades are not necessarily because an economy is badly run. It's just the consequences of these things. That needs to change. But you talk to the Financial Stability Board and they'll say, no, our job is to ensure financial stability. Yes, but it's in the context of 08, 09, not 24, 25. So what we're trying to do now is to make it easier to actually access that capital is by lowering the cost of it, by ensuring that the macroprudential frameworks support flowing of capital into developing and emerging economies. So I said, it's not just the economies themselves that need to work on making themselves and setting signals as they're doing. There's also frameworks that need to change, which are frankly anachronistic. And these are things that I'll be discussing with the Indonesian government tomorrow, because frankly, as part of the G20, this should be a very key focus for Indonesia, as I want it to be a focus of Brazil, South Africa, because these economies are net losers and it hurts access to the very capital they want. So these are sort of things that can happen.
Thanks, John. I think at this point, I'm keen to hear any questions from the floor to the panel members. Anyone? Yep, go ahead. If you don't mind, if you can let us know who you are or which institution you represent, etc., and then direct your questions to whoever.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is Christine Susana Chin. I'm from Indonesia Gentala Institute. My question is actually for all the panelists. It's with regard to the reality of technology, the potential technology decoupling between the US and the United States. How do private sector navigate this kind of like risks, and how should the region, particularly Southeast Asia, deal with it? Because if we look at, for example, investment in the port sector, for example, technology is it's sort of like incorporated in it. So what will happen if the Trump 2.0 administration will impose a further restrictive, and how will that impact the potential for investment in the region? Will the investment just follow the directions of, say, Trump administration's preferred countries in the region, say, for example, Philippines or Singapore or something like that? So would greatly appreciate any insights on that particular issues. Thank you.
Perhaps Mr. Choi?
Okay, I'll try to answer that. So far as I'm aware, so far the Trump administration, in fact, these regulations started coming in the Biden administration, the tail end of the Biden administration. So there are export controls, and there are also regulations on the use of US technology in any products. So I think where this is going to hit companies are really in hitting companies that are in the supply chain of goods that actually end up either in China or in the US, right? So if you are the one who produces something for China, you're not allowed to sell that thing to China if somewhere embedded in that there is US technology, right? So which means that you can't sell anything because it goes many, many layers down. Meaning to say, if there's a IP that has been embedded into a machine tool, and that machine tool is now used to, sort of produce your product, then you may not be able to use that and sell it to China, right? So everybody is still trying to interpret what that means. It potentially can be a total bifurcation, but we hope not. So, in these things where the regulations are so wide sweeping, actually you don't really know how it will be enforced and how, in the end, practically, would they take up so many cases, right? There are some things which are very clear. Obviously, if you're in a semiconductor area, then the products that are more first level, obviously, is going to be governed by the US tech regulations. And that one, I think everybody can see. It already has impact on some companies going through that supply chain, but they are also trying to catch up because you can foresee new regulations will come out soon. I think maybe a year or so ago, the US had said they characterized their regulations as a small yard high fence. I think the yard has become very, very wide now. Okay, and the fence is still just as high. So one has to be careful on that front. As far as selling things to the US, of course, if you are someone who has Chinese technology, then you have to worry about whether you can sell it in the US. So that again is something that companies that are producing products will have to just kind of interpret and then move forward in. As far as ports that you mentioned, I don't think that there will be such a big issue because you are not selling things to either China or to the US. So in that sense, you are somewhat sort of protected from that implication. But there are many other companies that will be affected by this.
Ray, do you have something? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's a great question. I think this is something that a lot of people are closely monitoring. I think if we think of, one of the mega trends that we are focused on is obviously the AI, proliferation of AI. And we are confident that AI will have a step change impact on every industry and will require a significant amount of investment. Now, you've probably seen the DeepSeek revelations that have come out more recently out of China, which are very exciting. And clearly, there's a lot more that we need to unpack. But I think that it only goes to show that actually there is competition between both sides. That's good. That will make the AI pie even bigger. But specifically with AI, we know the enabling infrastructure will be data centers, right? Now, how big these data centers will get, is there potential for technology efficiencies and so on? Of course, there's some potential there, but there is a huge build out required. And so then you get into access to, now as a data center operator on the infrastructure side, you're essentially building the hotel and the building and providing the air conditioning and the cooling and the fiber. You don't own and control what people put in the rooms. That's the customers. The customers in the US side, we have the Magnificent Seven, or the 5 hyperscalers, the Googles, Amazons, AWS, Microsofts of the world. And in China, you have the likes of ByteDance, Huawei, Alibaba, Tencent, the big ones. And so what's happening now, which, for example, just on this specific example of data centers, is, of course, there's a battle for chips, and there's restrictions on, through the CHIPS Acts and others, restrictions on access to high-end NVIDIA chips in particular. For example, in terms of procurement, Singapore is right in the center of that because Singapore's on the doorstep of Malaysia. There's a huge buildup of data center capacity, just by way of example. And essentially, you have certain companies that are procuring chips potentially for the use of data center customers that may be Chinese, right? Which is not technically illegal, it's a loophole in the legislation. Think of it as a type of supply chain reconfiguration. And these are the type of things that I think investors are concerned about. So if we come back to my Malaysia example, there are about 10 private equity firms that have exposure in Johor, in data centers. And there is risk. What will happen if there are tightened restrictions on what you can or cannot have in your data center, for example. So these are, again, as global investors, we hope the politics won't influence what is right for the economy and the enabling infrastructure, but of course we have to think about those risks, and this is part of the geopolitical uncertainty. We have to make certain judgments and assessment on case by case what would be an acceptable risk that we can underwrite.
Thanks, Ray. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. I am Amran Silalahi. I'm from Tenggara Strategics. I would like to have an emphasis on the regional-owned enterprise. What we have learned from various regional-owned enterprise, they would like to have a better opportunity to have a more private infrastructure investment contact with the investors, because they have learned from Jakarta. Jakarta regional-owned enterprise, they have a fruitful cooperation with Korea. So my question is there any opportunity for the regional-owned enterprise outside Jakarta to have more contact or more joint venture? Thank you.
I guess that would be a good question to the government, but I mean, let me, from my experience, and some of the other panel members may chip in. Generally, we find almost all international investors, they tend to joint venture with local entities. And if that local entity, depending on where the project is, happens to be a state-owned enterprise, that's not an issue, right? In fact, that is usually encouraged. For example, we take an airports, Bali airports, or Soekarno-Hatta, the fact that we have AP1, AP2, it's not the aspiration of the private sector to leave them out, but to actually to work with them at like, give you an example of the Delhi airport. The Airports Authority of India, they have what they call super minority, 26%. Right? So they don't control the operations. The operations are done by the private sector, but they still own some equity, right? For the purposes of the fact that they then learn from the private sector's efficiency, capacity, etc. John, do you have any advice on that in terms of how do we involve?
Well, actually, I think Indonesia has quite a good model. I mean, the reality is that one of the things that's very attractive is the competitiveness between regional governors to attract foreign investment. By the way, that's something we saw in China as well. In many respects, it was the competition of the provinces over who could be the most investable away from Beijing, which was very real here. Everyone has a part to play here. And those provinces and those regional governors that are actually most attuned to the need to attract foreign capital need to make certain they're telling their story. This is not a Jakarta story, this is actually an Indonesia story. And the competitiveness between the various provinces and between the governors is actually very important. By the way, as an airport investor as well at IFM, one of the areas that we would like to see more opportunity for investment is in the United States. One of the hardest areas to actually untap the right to invest in airports is actually in the US, which might sound strange to you. So Indonesia is already doing pretty well, and ASEAN is doing pretty well. It's just that I think the competition between the various governors could be very helpful here as well.
Thanks, John. Ambassador Kim, any last words?
I think that's. Let me just touch upon the first question from the floor. I think that's the most dominating concern in South Korea these days, especially with regard to the new Trump administration, is kind of the reciprocal tariffication that is now under study by the Trump administration. I think there's some of the Korean companies I just met, is they do have similar concerns as well, because most of the products are being exported from Indonesia, and a lion's share of their products, if it happens to those companies, I think that's being exported to United States. So they are quite seriously concerned about how much tariff will be levied on their products. So I think there's, for some sectors, I think there would be some sectors who will be severely affected by the kind of the challenges, whether it's tariff or some of the restrictions coming from the United States or other third countries. So I think the government should undertake some remedies or immediate and proper assistance to those who will be affected.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our session today. I hope you have gained some insights and you have, at the least, comforted by the fact that there is considerable interest, particularly from large investment houses like Global Infrastructure Partners and from the International Chamber of Commerce, and of course experts who have been very, very active in this region. Thank you so much, and please join me in thanking the distinguished panel members. Thank you.
What an insightful discussion we've just had, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for all of the speakers and also our moderator. Please remain on the stage, because for now we will personally thanking all of our speakers and also moderator, but we will kindly invite Bapak Rifki as the Director of Strategy and Administration Indonesia Business Council to please give a memento as a token of appreciation for all the speakers and moderator. And for now, ladies and gentlemen, we are witnessing that Bapak Rifki will deliver or handing out one of the memento to Kim Chang-Beom, Vice Chairman and CEO of Federation of Korean Industries. And now for Mr. John Denton, Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. Ray Nadarajah, Partner at Global Infrastructure Partnership Emerging Markets. And last but not least, for our speakers, we have Choi Kwok, Director and CEO of ISEAS, Yusof Ishak Institute, and of course, our very special moderator, Mr. Raj Kanan, Head of Infrastructure, Deloitte Asia Pacific. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause for all of our speakers and moderator. And please gather on the stage, gentlemen, because for now we are coming for a photo opportunity.